Also, it's a nice opportunity for me to do a little extra bonding with my son Ian, who's here on the drive up here yesterday. Appreciate the introduction. I just a little disappointed about one thing. I was really excited when I saw the drums. I thought I'd get a drum roll.
Good idea.
Must be for your next speaker. Could we perhaps have the first slide up? Okay. In fact, it's the first and only slide I'm going to show today. Being an academic type, I can't help but want to do a survey. I do this whenever I speak. And I would like to know, would each of you please check your shoes just briefly, just kind of checking. How many of you are worried about your carbon footprints? You know, there's been quite a lot of gnashing of teeth about that and concern. Some of it I find rather comical. But there was an incident 2 years ago that wasn't very funny. There was an Argentine family, a couple who shot themselves not before shooting their 2 children over their concern about global warming and their carbon footprints. Amazingly, the infants survived, but there's aspects of this hoax that are comical, but there are also larger aspects that are very tragic because of their impacts on every aspect of our life, most particularly energy, the nonsense about alternative energy and wind and solar, and those things which are nothing but a huge drain on our energy programs and our energy policy and on our lives and on our family budgets. I'm a space guy, and I've started a couple companies that have gone public in technology. Up until very recently, I didn't pay any attention to climate. I wasn't very interested in climate, and frankly, I'm still not. Other than the way it's being used and abused to push other agendas. Amen. Briefly, I'd like to mention that how I got interested in this. Someone who's come to be a very dear friend and respected friend named Fred Singer, very well-known climatologist. He was the first founder and director of the U.S. Weather Satellite Service. Came to my office at the University of Houston a few years ago. We both shared an interest in a subject that had nothing to do with climate, had to do with missions to Mars. It's what we do a lot of advanced planning at my center at the university for missions to the moon, Mars. We're quite well known for our mission planning and comprehensive design work for advanced space missions. So this was a subject we had quite a lot of interest in. And Fred mentioned during the course of conversation in my office that the satellites were telling a very different story. And something's making a lot of noise here. The satellites were telling a very different story than the surface temperature records. Most specifically in satellites, we've had satellites now in space since 1979. And they showed from those records that there was not warming in the tropospheric troposphere over the equator that we would expect to see if there was warming. In fact, it'd be absolutely all the models show that it would that there would be a warming spot if humans had any influence whatsoever, if carbon dioxide had any influence. And instead of warming, there was actually cooling. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't something I was terribly interested in. And it wasn't until perhaps a year later, I got thinking about, and I think this was sort of around the time Gore came out with his movie, Inconvenient Truth, which is certainly inconvenient, that I began to wonder if there's something we could learn from the way climate works that might be applied to life support systems for spacecraft and space, orbital spacecraft. And I didn't think there would be, and I still don't, but I thought it got me interested in the science. Incidentally, there are a lot of space people that get interested in climate, I think because it's challenging and there's a lot of dynamics going on. Jack Schmitt, who's walked on the moon, and Walt Cunningham is a very close friend of mine, Apollo astronaut, and Burt Rutan, a very extremely well-known and probably the most famous aerospace aircraft designer in our history. Very, very interested in this. So, and there are a lot of people at Johnson Space Center, particularly retirees, who have gotten very interested in the subject. But I was a novice, and I began to look at climate. And the more I looked at the science, the less sense it made. And I wondered if it was just me or whether there's something really amiss here. Out of that, I began to publish a lot of information about climate and energy and related topics on my website at the University of Houston. I didn't have any, it wasn't an intent to really influence anyone, it was to provide information, most particularly for my graduate students, to make information available on energy systems and so on. And more people say, well, you believe in global warming. And the way they said it was, you believe in, some religious idea. It wasn't a scientific question. And I would say, yeah, I believe global warming happens quite routinely, as does global cooling. And it's been going on for a long time, like forever. And some people got very angry. And through a number of iterations and so on, ultimately I wrote a book. I want to mention that I'm not connected to the oil and gas industry, although I certainly admire those who are. I'm not connected with big oil, little oil, snake oil. I'm a space guy. And I wrote the book because we aren't causing Greenland and Antarctica to melt, because the oceans aren't rising, because the polar bears and the penguins are really doing well. And if the polar bears have a problem, it's overpopulation. I wrote it because carbon dioxide isn't a pollutant. It's what makes plants grow. I wrote the book because I'm a parent and because I care about the future, as you do. I wrote it because we do have a crisis, a real crisis, and it's political. I wrote the book because I had to. And yes, there are copies that you can bring. Fortunately, walk home with that are on the table here, like my son has. There's also, because I'm not going to talk a lot about how climate works and climate stuff, which is something I usually talk about at events like this. There's a pamphlet, it's absolutely free, put out by an organization that I respect, and you can, that's a take-home for you if you'd like. That will give you a background. I'm very open to questions if there's time afterwards about climate and issues and carbon dioxide and those sort of things. Very comfortable talking about those things, but today I want to talk more about how we arrived at this crazy political time we're in with respect to climate. And for starters, I'd like to go back to a time, the 1970s and early 1980s, when it was noticed that we were coming out of a very prolonged cooling period, and temperatures appeared to be rising slightly. And incidentally, as was mentioned, I write a weekly column for Forbes. It's actually not true. I write usually 2 columns a week. And there will be an article coming out. Well, I talk about this next Sunday. I have an article coming out, as well as another one on Tuesday. But I have an article coming out the following week that will be a debate between Fred Singer and our state climatologist, John Nielsen Gammon, who I really respect, who is on a different side of the table than I am on this subject. I stay completely out of the discussion is between those two, regarding not whether there's been any warming since 1998. And incidentally, there's been no average warming globally for the last 17 years. But rather, has there been any warming since 1978? And there's a real debate on that, on how long have we been in this flat or cooling period. And if you will sign up afterwards and put your name there, I'll put you on my weekly list to get my articles, or if you simply Google Larry Bell Forbes, you'll have more pages than you ever dreamed of. And it will pull you up to my articles, my sites, and you can simply click on one of my articles, and there's a picture there of me, and it can say, "Follow me," and you'll get this, this information through Forbes. Going back to the 1970s and 80s, when we were coming out of this cooling period, that's the time when third world countries, by force of numbers, and the European Socialist Green parties, because they're very aggressive and persistent, seized control of the United Nations. They soon came to call for a new international economic order, a world order. By the late 1980s, a scare based upon theoretical and primitive climate models predicted that we were going through warming, dangerous warming, due to man-made carbon emissions. That was an ideal opportunity for them. So in response, the United Nations established something called the Framework Convention on Climate Change, FCCC, to organize conferences. And they also organized the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Many of you, or most of you, may have heard of IPCC, because that's where you get the scary stuff from the United Nations about ocean rises and climate change and so on, and what a dire problem we are creating by exhaling. The central strategy of FCCC and IPCC behind this was to establish the Kyoto Protocol. And it was centered on something you hear as anthropogenic global warming, or in other words, man-caused global warming. It was a brilliant scheme. It was based, to have cap and trade. In other words, you put a credit value on cutbacks in the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by fossil burning industries, and then you let other industries that produce less buy those emission credits, purchase those emission credits. It's kind of like, let's say you don't have any prison record and you get a call from some inmate in Huntsville. And they say, well, you got a pretty good record. Can I buy some of your credits? And you say, yeah, I'm not using them. What a deal. So Kyoto Protocol was a way of selling air. It's better than bottled water. How can you beat it? So the cap and trade program behind the Kyoto Protocol punished the developing countries because we're producing too much carbon dioxide, so that less development countries could purchase them or completely get away free. And China and India, which produce huge amounts, and they're producing more all the time of carbon dioxide, were given a pass because of their developing country status. Going back to FCCC's early times, they organized a conference in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And this conference was the kickoff for the Kyoto Protocol. The conference organizer, a fellow named Maurice Strong, who's a very interesting guy, you may want to Google him sometime, expressed the real theme of the conference. Understand, this is 1992. Following a cooling period, with just a recent indication of warming, and he said, we may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for the industrialized civilization to collapse. Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? Maurice Strong left no doubt where to place the blame for global problems. Quote, it is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, ownership of motor vehicles, golf courses, small electric appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. A shift is necessary towards lifestyles less geared to environmentally damaging consumption patterns. Someone who echoed that theme, someone else you might want to Google, remember, is a former senator named Timothy Worth. He was a senator, a Democrat senator from Colorado. He spoke at that conference. And he spoke then, not as senator, because by this time he had become U.S. Undersecretary of State for Global Issues under the Clinton-Gore administration, representing them at this meeting. I quote, "We have got to ride the global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we will be doing the right thing in terms of economic policy and environmental policy." Incidentally, Worth now has the United Nations Foundation, which lobbies for hundreds of millions of dollars from us to help underdeveloped countries fight climate change. Someone else spoke at that conference, representing the Clinton-Gore administration, a Deputy Assistant of State, Richard Benedict. He then headed the Policy Division of the U.S. State Department, and he agreed that the Kyoto Protocol should be approved, whether or not it had anything to do with climate change or not. he said, I quote, "A global warming treaty must be implemented, even if there is no scientific evidence to back the enhanced greenhouse effect," unquote. So we went from this period of detected warming. Let's fast forward now a mere 10 years to 1988. And incidentally, when I mentioned 10 or 12 years, a climate cycle is generally accepted to be 30 years. So 10 or 12 years, or when I said earlier that we haven't seen any warming for the last 17 years, is still not climate. Climate is 30 years. Technically, you can set the number sort of whatever you want, but that's accepted. So when I said we haven't seen any warming for 17 years, am I saying we'll never see warming again? No. But I will say in passing, you might want to read my article, which comes out Sunday, where leading solar scientists are saying we may not see warming for a very long time because of the very low sunspot activity. And that's something I won't take the time to discuss now unless you want to talk about in questions if there's time. I'll be glad to talk about it. And with the ocean cycles, which are totally natural, we may be in for a cold spell. And in the title of my article coming out Sunday, I can't remember exactly the title, but something like, "Hold on to your long flannel underwear." 1998, this is a dozen years or so after all, the climate's warming, we need to have the Kyoto Protocol thing is just warming up. And here's Al Gore, former vice president, in case you haven't heard his name, climate guru, Academy Award winner, hosted a conference in 1988. It was a hot summer on the East Coast. So he hosted held a conference in Washington on a climate crisis. James Hansen was the keynote speaker. If you haven't heard of James Hansen, he just retired from NASA. Thank God. And here's Timothy Worth. The guy keeps showing up. Timothy Worth is quoted. He was one of the planners for this Al Gore conference. Here's what he said. This was an interview with PBS Frontline. "We called the Weather Bureau and found out what was historically the hottest day of the summer. So we scheduled a hearing that day, and bingo! It was the hottest day on record in Washington, or close to it. We went in the night before and opened all the windows so the air conditioning wasn't working inside the room. It was really hot. A lot of the people back in the 70s were predicting that the next ice age is coming. There's a lot of alarming stuff in the New York Times and even scientific journals about, New York's going to be crushed by, ice, moving glaciers and so on. And some of the leading proponents for that scare about the coming ice age became leading proponents for the global warming hysteria today. And incidentally, people say, isn't it warm? You say, yeah, it is abnormally warm. There's no question about it. Because if you look at climate over the last 400,000 years or so, we go through 100,000 years of ice age. Then we have a little blip called an interglacial that lasted 12 to 15,000 years, which fortunately we're in right now. Then it goes back to another ice age that lasts another 90, 100,000 years. It is abnormally warm. I think we should be rather grateful for that. And one of the One of the leading proponents for the notion that we were in a coming ice age period was the late Stanford University professor Stephen Schneider. He authored a book, 1976 book called The Genesis Strategy. He said that global warming posed a major threat to humanity. Later, Schneider changed that view 180 degrees and became lead author for important parts of 3 sequential IPCC reports on global warming. One of the big proponents for global warming alarm was Enron. Between 1994 and 1996, then Senator Wirth, there's that name again, he became Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs later. He became working very closely with Enron to lobby Congress to grant EPA the authority to control carbon dioxide. At that time, Enron owned the largest natural gas pipeline outside of the Soviet Union. And natural gas was having a hard time competing with coal. It's not so true today, thanks to fracking and no thanks to this administration. And the notion was that natural gas produced less carbon dioxide than coal. So Enron needed some help tipping the scale in favor of natural gas. And so the mounting hype about 1988 from Al Gore's testimony provided the ideal opportunity. At that time, Senator Wirth and John Heinz, Republican from Pennsylvania, the former husband of John Kerry's wife, had recently co-sponsored a project called Project 88. That was to provide a pathway for converting environmental issues into business opportunities. And they were successful in changing from evolving Project 88 into the Clean Air Act of 1990. You remember the big deal about acid rain? Our taxpayers, our government, spent $500 million on a study of acid rain. It was supposed to be attributed to industry. How many of you saw the results of that study? Very few people, because there was no smoking gun. But it was successful in pushing through the kind of trading program for sodium dioxide. And Enron was a big player. And so they thought, well, why can't we do the same thing with carbon dioxide? Sodium dioxide isn't a real good thing, and it makes your eyes water and smog and so on. So they thought, why can't we do the same thing with carbon dioxide? Well, they had a problem. Carbon dioxide wasn't a pollutant. At least it wasn't then. It was plant fertilizer. So the EPA had no ability to regulate it. Enron's CEO, Kenneth Lay, had direct contact with the White House and reportedly had met with President Clinton and Vice President Gore on August 4th, 1997 to prepare a strategy to get the U.S. support for the Kyoto Protocol. They wanted to establish a carbon market that Enron desperately needed Congress to endorse. In 1997, Enron lobbyist John Palmanacia, and I'm really messing this up, Palmaisano, wrote excitedly from Kyoto, quote, "If implemented, the Kyoto Protocol will do more to promote Enron's business than almost any other regulatory initiative outside the restructuring of the electricity and natural gas industries in Europe and the United States. The endorsement of emissions trading was another victory for us. This agreement will be good for Enron stock." Sadly, that was not to be. The Senate passed unanimously, and when's the last time you saw a unanimous Senate resolution passed? This was 95 to nothing. A bipartisan Byrd-Hagel U.S. Senate Resolution 98, made it clear the U.S. would not be signatory to any agreement that would, quote, result in serious harm to the economy of the United States. Clinton was no dummy. He never sent that up for ratification to the Senate. Although, if you hear Gore talk about it, it sounds like Bush did it. I wrote an article recently about the greening of Gore's bank account. The guy has made an estimated excess of $200 million since leaving his post as vice president. And that's, I think, an interesting article. Incidentally, when I write for Forbes, they don't like it if I'm wrong. And so the fact that the article is still there along with the other 200 I've written, I think suggests the fact I do my fact-checking rather carefully. In those early days, 2004, Al Gore had co-founded Generation Investment Management, LLP, GIM, along with 3 partners, former chief of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, David Blood, and 2 others from Goldman Sachs, for projects that were going green. Bloomberg reported, this is back by March 2008, that investment fund had raised $5 billion and was turning away investors. Incidentally, those investors haven't done real well. I want to talk a little bit more about Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCCs. There's an organization called the Institute for Public Policy Research, IPPR. It's a think tank that actually likes carbon dioxide cuts and cap and trade and all this crazy carbon taxing stuff. But they made a comment back in 2006 that I think is rather interesting, where this is a quote, they said, "Climate change is typified by an inflated or extreme lexicon, incorporating an urgent tone of cinematic codes. It employs a quasi-religious register of death and doom, and it uses language of acceleration and irreversibility." The IPPR concluded that alarmism might even be secretly thrilling, effectively a form of what they refer to as climate porn. What am I doing? Can you hear me?
Who's our mic guy?
Am I back on?
Nope.
Hello?
He's working on
Can you hear me now?
it. He's working on it.
Much of the really scary stuff that we hear about climate, am I on?
No.
I'll use it.
Is this live?
No.
Nope.
Is it live now?
Yep.
You're on now. You have to turn the lapel mic off.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Much of the scary stuff we hear about climate comes from the IPCC. Drum roll, please. We hear that these papers that are being reported, incidentally, I want you to understand, IPCC does no climate research. It's a survey organization. What they do is they go through a whole lot of reports that are published, so-called peer review reports, to call out the ones that they want to cite with respect to climate issues. These reports are supposed to be peer reviewed. However, a lot of them are not. And a lot of them have been proven to be very misleading and fallacious. But I think a lot of the people that go through these reports, and it's an international group of scientists, are good people. But these groups are headed by people who are political appointees. And there are generally two heads of each of these groups, each of these topical groups. One has to come from an underdeveloped country or developing country, the other comes from a developed country. And you can imagine that suggests that the expertise level isn't necessarily the highest, it's leadership level, but it's worse than that. After all of these reports are reviewed, there's a summary report, is the one you actually see, that takes out the really juicy stuff that the politicians want and presents it to the media. That's the stuff you hear. And on some of those occasions, what is reported in the summaries that you read is 180 degrees different from what the scientists who reviewed it say. These many irregularities in one of the reports provoked Dr. Frederick Seitz, who was a world-famous physicist. He was a former president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and the president of the American Physical Society. He was the president of Rockefeller University. And he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, "I have never witnessed a more disturbing corruption of the peer review process than events that led up to this IPCC report." Several tens of thousands of scientists have lodged formal protests regarding IPCC practices, not just a few. And I've also written an article, one coming out, I believe it's Sunday, I think it's in the Sunday article or in the Tuesday article, about this 97% of scientists agree that global warming is real. Those are phony surveys. I've written about them extensively. James Taylor has written about them extensively. I mention them again. You can click on my website is provided on my article, and it'll give you the background on those surveys. They're a sham. They're embarrassing, particularly since one came from a so-called scientific organization. One of the people who is now citing, the fact that global warming is not what he believes, is a renowned scientist named James Lovelock. James Lovelock is a wonderful guy. He's a very informed person. But he had previously, he drank the carbon dioxide Kool-Aid. And in 2006, he had claimed, before this century is over, billions of us will die, and the few breeding pairs of people that survive will be in the Arctic, where climate remains stable. Recently, Lovelock has changed. He's obviously cooled on global warming. He admitted to MSNBC that he had overstated the case, and he acknowledges that, quote, "We don't know what the climate's doing. We thought we knew 20 years ago. That led to some alarmist books, mine included, because it looked clear-cut, but it hasn't happened." Lovelock pointed to Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth and Tim Flannery's The Weathermakers as other alarmist publications. Others have also changed. There's Dr. Fritz Verenholt, and I've written about him and I've communicated with him. Is a socialist, a former founder of Germany's environmental movement. And he headed the renewable energy division of the country's second largest utility company. But recently he's authored a book, co-authored actually, a book called The Cold Sun, Why the Climate Disaster Won't Happen. And he charges IPCC with gross incompetence and dishonesty, most particularly regarding fear-mongering exaggeration of known climate influences due to human carbon dioxide emissions. Incidentally, he did this because he had read what IPCC had written on renewable energy, found so many errors in it that he decided to look into what they were doing with climate, and he was astounded at how incompetent they were, which led him to write the book. Another person that's changed is Greenpeace co-founder Patrick Moore, who now believes that any benefits of global warming, to the extent they occur, the benefits are highly underrated. I'm quoting Patrick Moore. He said, "We do not have any scientific proof that we are the cause of global warming that has occurred in the last 200 years. The alarmism has driven us through scare tactics to adopt energy policies that are going to create a huge amount of energy poverty among the poor people. It's not good for people. It's not good for the environment. In a warmer world, we can produce more food." When Patrick Moore was asked who was responsible for promoting unwarranted fear and what their motives would be, what he says is very consistent with what I say in my book. He says, and I quote, "A powerful convergence of interests, scientists seeking grant money, media seeking headlines, universities seeking huge grants from major institutions, foundations, environmental groups, politicians wanting to make it look like they're saving future generations. And all these people have converged on this issue." While there can be no doubt that manufactured climate crisis drives multi-billion-dollar science and EPA energy regulatory industries, the United Nations has far more ambitious goals. As Christine Stewart, who was then Canadian Minister of the Environment, said, speaking to the Calgary Herald in 1998, quote, "No matter if the science of global warming is all phony, climate change provides the greatest opportunity to bring about justice and equality in the world." IPCC official Otmar Edenhofer admitted in November 2010, quote, "One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. Instead, climate change policy is now about how we redistribute de facto the world's wealth." If you've got any doubt about this, you can go back to the United Nations conference in 2010 that was held in Cancun, Mexico. It's rather interesting because at that 2010 conference, the developing countries were saying, you know, we were just really ravaging the world here in the US and in Europe, and we should compensate them for the damage, suggesting that we pay them $10 billion. You know, originally that they wanted their fair share paid. So our US representative, none other than Hillary Clinton, suggested that we pay $10 billion a year. between 2010 and 2012, that would, we would start paying them $10 billion a year. They regard that as a total insult. Not nearly enough. So Hillary and our president upped the ante to $100 billion a year, coming from the U.S. and Europe, of course. And where might you think that would come from? One of the very popular speakers, you know, she never even got much applause, Hillary. They're supposed to love us by now. The person that got the applause was Hugo Chavez. He spoke there and he got a tremendous ovation. He said, quote, "Our revolution seeks to help all people. Socialism, that's the way to save the planet. Capitalism is the road to hell. Let's fight against capitalism and make it obey us." If you think I'm sounding a bit conspiratorial, let's look at what Mikhail Gorbachev said. He said, "The threat of environmental crisis will be the international disaster key to unlock the new world order. This may well have seemed like the last hope for the agenda following the USSR's economic collapse in 1991. Also, remember the words of then President Jacques Chirac of France, a strong supporter of the Kyoto Protocol, who said, and I quote, "For the first time, humanity is instituting a genuine instrument of global governance, one that should find a place within the World Environmental Organization, which France and the European Union would like to see established." I'd like to also mention that Europe's fiasco with Kyoto and their fiasco with so-called green energy is taking a big toll now on the green movement. Wouldn't it be nice if our Secretary of State and President read the newspapers? Or maybe asked a sidebar question occasionally at some of these conferences about how, by the way, how are you doing with this greenhouse warming stuff in Europe? Countries are dropping out of Kyoto. They're realizing cap and trade, which has become a tremendous fiasco and scam, is collapsing. So the UN's IPCC summary for policymaker reports say it all. They represent prescriptions for distribution of wealth and resource distribution, including regionalized and smaller economies to reduce transportation demand. Sound like Agenda 21 to you? Mm-hmm. Reorienting lifestyles away from consumption, resource sharing through co-ownership, and encouraging citizens to pursue free time over wealth. So are you ready? Welcome to the climate alarm-founded ant farm they have in mind for us.